Hi everybody, nice to see you all again. Welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a bit of a blether. It's going to be about Chinese, but there are going to be some more general observations about language learning here that will hopefully be of interest to at least some of you. What I want to talk about is my complete and utter lack of interest in reading Chinese or using reading in Chinese to help me study Chinese and improve my Chinese. This is in contrast to the other languages that I've studied, Japanese, Russian, Spanish, when I've been happy to actually do quite a lot of reading. I've enjoyed doing a lot of reading, a lot of very intense reading. I wanted to talk a bit about why I'm not interested in doing that in Chinese and the implications that has for the idea that there is a single language learning technique or approach or algorithm that we can apply consistently across the board in language learning. A couple of years ago, maybe a bit more than that, when I was getting back into my Chinese and getting more serious about it, I spent a bit of time using a website that those of you who study Chinese may be familiar with. It's called the Chairman's Bao, B-A-W, right? And it is quite a good site. It presents Chinese news articles simplified down to different levels: HSK1, HSK2, HSK3, HSK4, and so on and so forth. So you can get a lot of different articles on different topics with a whole variety of different vocabulary and expressions coming up, and it's all catered to specific levels. You have to subscribe. It's a pretty good resource. I subscribed for a month and crammed a load of stuff and then cancelled before the end of the month. Did that a couple of times, but a couple of years ago now. I haven't gone back to it for a while. This isn't a plug for them. I don't know them. I don't get any money from them. I'm just mentioning it. What I realized before too long when I started studying like that was that I hated it. I really hated having to read or try and read Chinese. And this is coming from someone who was good enough at Japanese to work as a translator. You know, I used to translate financial documents for a living when I lived in Japan. Somebody who was already familiar with, say, a couple of thousand, hard to say, but let's say a couple of thousand Chinese characters. I hated it. I hated having to interact with Chinese in written form. So I can only imagine what it must seem like to people who don't have that sort of background in Japanese. I can only imagine what it's like for people who have to try and learn all this stuff from scratch at the same time as they're trying to learn the language more generally. It's grammar, it's phonetics and phonology, people who are trying to learn to listen, people who are trying to learn to speak a bit. Trying to learn Chinese in its written form must be utterly excruciating. I was a bit taken aback by this. When I studied Japanese many years ago at university, I found that kanji, and many people have this experience, kanji, at least in the beginning, one of the most exotic and fascinating aspects of the whole process. That, I think, turned around and bit me on the backside a bit with Chinese, in the sense that I'd already gone through this sort of process. I'd already made a huge commitment of time and energy decades earlier to learn to read Japanese, and the idea of having to go through a similar process again to flesh out my Chinese reading was not very attractive. Most of you are probably aware of the fact that the Chinese use many more characters on the whole than the Japanese do. You know, you can find different estimates as to the core character sets and different estimates as to how many characters are used in more complex or literary language in these two languages, but you need to know a lot more characters to read Chinese well. That much is clear. I did not enjoy reading Chinese or trying to read it. It's not only about the number of characters, it's about the density of characters and what you're reading. Japanese is actually fairly forgiving in this regard because much of what is written in Japanese is written in kana, whether hiragana or katakana, right? The fact that Japanese is written in this hybrid fashion with these different writing systems, kanji, hiragana and katakana essentially, makes it much, much, much easier for the eye to pick up on the word boundaries. In the beginning it's hard, but once you've been studying Japanese for a while, it's pretty damn obvious where the word boundaries are. The way in which the Japanese use kanji That is one of the components in making it so easy to see where the word boundaries are. Chinese is a nightmare because every Chinese character is a Chinese character, right? That's all they have. They only have Chinese characters. Yes, they can use our numerals. Presumably they use the Latin alphabet occasionally to refer to foreign companies. I don't know. But basically, even foreign companies like Google or Facebook or whatever have their own Chinese versions, their own Chinese names, and they're written in Chinese characters. So what you see in Chinese is this horrible block of incomprehensible, basically, hieroglyphics. And you're not given any leg up in terms of parsing that and seeing where the word boundaries are. Obviously, you would improve in this regard with time. If I'd spent a lot of time reading Chinese, dealing with it in written form, I would undoubtedly have improved a lot, and my reading speed would have improved. But I wasn't sure that I wanted to go through that process. Another thing, this is a related point, but in Japanese they use katakana for writing not only foreign loan words, but foreign loan words, mainly in this day and age from English. So when you encounter foreign names, place names, foreign companies, foreign whatever, they'll be written in katakana and they jump out at you. It's immediately obvious when you are looking at some sort of foreign name, like I said, place name, company name, a given name, a personal name, etc., etc. In Chinese, all this stuff is written again in Chinese characters. So you can stare at something and not have the slightest idea what it is or where the word boundaries are, and then you look down at the glossary, because on this website, the Chairman's Bow, they very conveniently provide a glossary, and you can see that the thing you're looking at is Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. Very frustrating to stare at this stuff and only later figure out that you're just looking at someone's name. It seems that there is a set of characters that the Chinese use over and over again, repeatedly, for writing foreign names. So this is presumably child's play to them. They can tell at a glance that they're looking at a foreign name. And again, with practice, you would improve in this regard, but I found it quite brutal. So in these senses, I didn't particularly like trying to read Chinese. And then there was another reason that I didn't like it, and I still haven't quite got my head around this one. You know, I read the first proper book that I read in Russian was Game of Thrones. I wanted to read something that I'd already read in English and that I liked and that I would be motivated to reread. So I read Game of Thrones, and that's a long book. And I read the whole damn thing, and I took such extensive notes that I had a Google Docs document that was 560 A4 pages of notes. My notes were almost longer than the book itself, but I really enjoyed reading that. I learned so much. And I always felt that the language I was exposed to was perfectly useful. It just seemed current, useful, viable. I felt that it was language that I myself would be able to put to use in principle in real life. Not talking about all the vocabulary, all the names of all the different pieces of armour. No, they're not that useful. But the language itself, in a deeper sense, seemed to be current and useful and accessible. But for some reason that I've not quite figured out yet, when I was reading these articles on the Chairman's Bow, I couldn't see anything useful in there linguistically, really, apart from the vocabulary itself. When I listened to Chinese, I could find stuff that I liked. You know, when you listen to something, whatever it may be, and you take lots of notes and you write down lots of nice structures, nice phrases, nice collocations, whatever. I just wasn't finding stuff like that. I had this very peculiar sense that the Chinese used in colloquial Chinese and the Chinese used in formal written Chinese were so different to each other that the written form of the language wasn't offering up anything particularly useful structurally. And that was a strange experience. I still haven't figured out exactly why that was the case, but it was. And when I look back at my notes, the notes I was taking from the Chairman's Bow, I felt that I was looking at long lists of relatively isolated words, and that is not a very helpful way of attacking a language. You need chunks, fragments, phrases, clauses, whole sentences sometimes. You need to see the language in action in the notes you take. I don't use Anki. I have my own system that I suppose is roughly equivalent. But I felt like what was ending up on the page after I'd taken notes from Chen's Bao wasn't really Chinese. It was just some words that had been extracted from Chinese. And that made me feel very uneasy. The last reason I suppose that I decided not to work with written Chinese anymore was just that I don't care about it. I don't want to read novels in Chinese. I don't want to read any kind of book in Chinese. I do not want to browse the internet in Chinese. I do not care. If I ever go to China or any other Chinese-speaking country in the future, yes, the Chinese don't like it if you think of Taiwan as being a separate country. I don't want to get into that here. All I'm saying is that if I ever end up in an environment where I need to be able to read signs or billboards or stuff like that in Chinese, I will get by. I can read Japanese, and all the notes I take when I watch podcasts or whatever in Chinese, all the notes I take, vocabulary, fragments, clauses, collocations, linguistic chunks in general, I write all that stuff down in Chinese. So I'm actually getting quite a lot of exposure to the language in that written form, but I do not want to focus on actually reading it per se. I find that to be quite an unpleasant and, from my point of view, pointless experience. And this is the first time I've ever taken reading and excluded it from my core interests in a language. I've never been that interested in writing in the foreign languages that I have studied, but this is the first time I've excluded reading. And I think it's partly to do with the fact that I'm getting older and I have to be a little bit more careful about what exactly I put my time and my energy into. 1,000 hours of study is a lot of study, and I don't want to be shunting it, so to speak, in the wrong direction or focusing on the wrong kind of stuff. And I just want to say in closing that this is one reason that I've come to be a bit skeptical about the idea that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to learning any language. The 4 languages that I've studied, I've actually studied them in quite different ways. I studied Japanese at university, studied Spanish, grammar mainly by myself, and I've just done a lot of conversation practice, lived in Spanish-speaking countries, picked stuff up here and there. Russian, I studied with a teacher in the beginning to try and get some sort of grip on Russian grammar, and then after about 4 months I transitioned to doing a lot of conversation practice and a huge amount of revision of everything that came up in those conversations, and I just sort of expanded from there. Chinese, I've stopped and started, struggled to maintain motivation, discipline, didn't do much listening in the beginning, came back to a very listening heavy approach, but a very reading light approach. If you're doing something that seems like it should be useful, then it probably is useful, and if you keep doing it over a long enough period of time, then you should make progress. And that's one of the reasons why I feel pretty content with the situation in which I'm not reading Chinese. Especially in this day and age where we have YouTube, we have so much audio content of one sort or another. Our ability to extract the language from that listening material is greater than it's ever been, simply because there's so much of it available. Sometimes with subtitles, if you need them or want them. So that's it for today. Just some hopefully semi-coherent thoughts on reading in the study of Chinese, and some thoughts on whether or not there is a one-size-fits-all approach to language learning in general. Anyway, that is it for today. Thank you very much for dropping by. I do appreciate it. Feel free to let me know what you think of all this in the comments, and if you have any ideas for future videos, I would be very pleased to hear them. That's it. Thanks very much. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.